No, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, except for when they don't, because every Tuesday on this show and on our Hard Times Radio History YouTube channel, the historian Ian Wilson joins me for our regular feature, If Only We'd Known, explaining why actually the present rather closely resembles the past. And today we're looking at the government's asylum plans and how they fit into the long history of Europe's immigration debate. And Ian Wilson is with me in the studio right now. Hello.
Hi, Hugo.
Thanks for being with us. So look, we've been talking about Shabana Mahmood's policies, her plans. You say you've seen something similar before in 1950s Germany. Well, the 1950s is a very important point there.
I think it is.
Let's just say.
It's after the war, and obviously the huge numbers of Germans have been killed in the war, and they had a labour shortage. And you're all too young, listeners, and you, Hugo, but there was this thing that we always used to hear about when I was growing up in the 60s, that the economic miracle that Germany had performed. It had been a country completely smashed to bits by the war, and it had lost huge numbers of people, and then suddenly it was the richest country in Europe and most successful in business, etc. And the reason for that was that they had this policy of importing labour, cheap labour, it must be said, mainly from Turkey, and they called the workers guest workers, Gastarbeiter, and they had this scheme that you went to Germany, you earned far more money than you would have done in Turkey or sometimes from Greece or Southern Europe. You normally had a contract for 2 years, and sometimes you could stay. I mean, some people stay for 20 years in Germany, but you never had any citizens' rights. You didn't have a pension at the end of it. You didn't. You had to pay tax, very strangely enough, and it's very strange anyone agreed to this. You paid tax, but you didn't get any benefits if you were ill or your family was ill. And it was still worth their while. But the Turkish government got fed up with this and said, we're not going to go on sending stuff. So by the early 70s, it came to an end. Right,
okay, so that kind of sort of temporary...
But it's very similar, the reason I mention it, it's very, very similar to what Shabana Mahmood has proposed.
It's basically foreign workers without domestic rights.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Britain's always been shaped by immigration. Are the concerns that we see now, is that something new and different because the population is so much larger, or is it same old, same old?
I think it's a bit of same old, really. Because, I mean, I think it is a very depressing debate. I'm rather on the side of the kind of Labour rebels about this, because it just makes Britain seem an unkind, nasty kind of country. I don't think it's going to reduce the illegal immigrants at all, because they evidently have ways of getting round these things, and they've beaten us in so many different ways. When I say us, I mean law-abiding citizens. And I can't see how it can stop these gangs putting people into boats. What it will do is make the lives of refugees from countries where evidently it's intolerable to live, either for climate or political reasons, much, much more difficult. And the cruelty, we've seen what's happened in America when Trump separated families from their children. It's just a horrible prospect, in my opinion.
The idea of, as you say, Gastarbeiter, guest workers in Britain or indeed elsewhere. I mean, I guess the competing, one of the sort of competing issues with immigration is, on the one hand, what we want is, we do want workers to come and contribute to our economy. We also want people to integrate and not have their own separate communities. Presumably, guest workers, Gastarbeiter, are less likely to integrate because they're not going to be here for the duration.
That's what's said. But actually, I mean, the reality in the big cities, which is where most immigrants live, as anybody listening to this knows, wherever you happen to live, if you live in an urban environment, the reality is that people keep to themselves. There's a kind of, it's not apartheid, but, you know, Turkish workers in Germany then and Turkish workers now in London tend to live in Turkish parts of London. Irish workers always did that. And so on and so forth. And we all know that's the case. I don't think it necessarily matters. I think the idea of being integrated, so long as you can speak English, I don't think integration is that important really nowadays, because we're all used to living cheek by jowl with lots of very different sorts of people.
Do we have a slightly false and rose-tinted view of assimilation in the past? I mean, some people point to, for example, Jewish immigrants in the late 19th, early 20th century. My own family, indeed, were an example of that, as an example of an immigrant that assimilated into British culture.
Where did they come into, Hugo?
They came into Edinburgh.
Edinburgh.
Well, I think they came literally into Southampton or something.
So there was a reasonable Jewish community. I mean, they weren't the only Jews in the village sort of thing.
No. In fact, they moved into streets where they basically took over a couple of streets. And you know what? 2 generations on, they're extremely assimilated. But I guess I asked because I'm minded that first generation, you know what? The women didn't speak English. They did very much work among themselves. They didn't necessarily integrate with the wider community.
Then the children start going to school, and that's when integration happens. Yeah. And I think that would happen actually with Gastarbeiter if we had them here. I mean, the Jewish situation is different somehow. I mean, this is an awful thing to say, but I'm going to say it also. Most of the Jewish immigrants to Britain were much, much more sophisticated than the kind of guest workers we're talking about.
Not my lot, they weren't.
No, I said most. I mean, when you think of all the people who were locked up on the Isle of Man.
Yeah, sure.
And then they came out, and it was the Amadeus String Quartet, and it was professors of Latin and things like that. That's what I mean by sophisticated. I'm not suggesting that Jewish people are cleverer than people from Bangladesh. It's just that they were people who'd been hoiked out of a middle class or academic or professional environment in Germany for obvious reasons, because Hitler was going to kill them. And that's rather different. And therefore they couldn't easily assimilate the first generation, but they could easily find occupations which made them very, very desirable citizens.
So look, I mean, we can talk about this in 2 ways. We can talk about it as the economic impact of immigration, which most people agree is broadly desirable, although it's perhaps a bit more complicated than that.
Well, it's not merely desirable, it's essential. If you think of fruit picking, care workers, medical workers, etc., etc., without immigrants, the National Health Service would collapse. The fruit farming industry, the flower picking industry would collapse.
But there's also the cultural issue, and you suggest that the most anti-immigration feeling in this country, not just but including among Reform voters, is more culturally based.
I'm sure it is. And the reason that Enoch Powell, in a way, had a point, and certainly was a very popular politician way back when he made this famous Rivers of Blood speech, was he was talking about the cultural effect on a town like Wolverhampton, which he represented, Leicester, Bradford, Bingley, so many towns in the north, Oldham, they were completely changed by having huge influx of people from South Asia. And the people from South Asia weren't doing any harm, but they were changing the climate, the cultural climate. And I think there's still, in the British, not everybody, of course, but I think that the kind of people who are drawn to voting Reform, with a bit of themselves, they would deny this, but with a bit of themselves, they would like to go back to a kind of Captain Mannering world where there weren't any brown people.
Well, to draw this briefly back then to 1950s Germany, do you not think those towns would have changed anyway? Because one looks at the situation, particularly in sort of the east of Germany. Everyone's left.
Of course.
Everyone's left and nobody's come. And they're ghost towns.
Of course. And what Enoch Powell and his admirers didn't realise was that huge cultural change was happening anyway, and that immigration was just a symptom of it.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't that people arrived from India or Pakistan, as it was in those days, and changed Leicester. It was that Leicester was full of people who were changing, I mean, for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, always fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. That is Ian Wilson. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. And look, if you enjoyed that feature and want more history content, do head online to our history channel. Just search for Times Radio History on YouTube and you will find it there.